Welcome back, Left Reckoners. I'm Matt Lick. With me as ever, David Griscom. Hello, David.
Hey, brother.
And joining us once again, Ben Case. Ben is a researcher, writer, organizer, postdoctoral scholar at the Center for Work and Democracy. You've also seen Ben recently on Left Reckoning earlier this year with his very interesting piece co-authored with James Sebens in Inkstick Media, at Inkstick Media, What's Happening in Gaza is Not a War, It's a Massacre, which I'd invite people to go and revisit because I think it's still relevant, unless there's updates on that front, Ben. But now you have been turning your efforts towards local democracy. Can you just introduce what this project is you've been working on in Pittsburgh before we get to the results of it?
Yeah, totally. I'm really happy to be on talking about this. A really incredible campaign that I was able to be part of this past summer. It was a bit of worlds colliding for me. My day job is researching ballot initiatives and direct democracy at the Center for Work and Democracy, which is a research center attached to Arizona State University. Also, actually, a research assistant professor now. I got promoted from postdoc recently. But that's my day job. I was doing that. I also, care very deeply about Palestine solidarity. It's something I've been involved in for a long time. As a Jewish person in the Jewish community, and also more broadly. And this is. This idea kind of came about as those worlds colliding. I was spending time at the encampment at University of Pittsburgh here because I work remote most of the time, and so I was just doing my work from there and hanging out there a lot of the time. And I was chatting with some of the organizers, specifically this one guy named Kareem Safeddin, who's a grad student in sociology, who's one of the organizers of the encampment. And he knew a little bit about my research, and he kind of just said, well, what about a local referendum on divestment here? And it's one of those things someone says to you and you're like, oh shit, yeah, what about that? That's a really good idea. I think for me, as a scholar, I approach most of my my research and my sort of theoretical work with an organizer hat on first. Organizing to me comes first, and then the theory and the research, they all inform each other. But this is actually one area that, when I got this job a few years ago to lead the ballot initiative research at the center I'm at, I didn't have a lot of experience directly doing this kind of organizing. So I approached this more as a researcher. And I think there's a lot there. Work on a lot of, articles. I'm working on a book about it now. But I was really approaching it more as a researcher. I had never, apart from volunteering for, a local initiative a few years ago, gathering some signatures, very low-key volunteering. I really had never been part of a campaign like this. But it sort of hit me when he said that, oh yeah, no, this is a really good idea. This is exactly what this sort of thing is designed for. When you ask politicians, you pressure, you do everything you can, and you don't get any satisfaction, this is popular, and you're still not getting anything from either political party. This is what these sort of directly democratic mechanisms are there for. This is what people have fought for them to be there for, a century or more ago, right? And so it also hit me that I didn't really know how it works in Pittsburgh. The U.S. has a very, a lot of politics, it's very wonky systems. It's all state by state, municipality by municipality. Pennsylvania doesn't have state level. I should also so in my brief ballot initiative spiel, when I say ballot initiatives, I mean a vote on a policy directly instead of a politician. So if you vote, you often see them at the end of your ballot. Oftentimes they're very seemingly mundane things like minor adjustments to zoning or hunting licenses or something like that. But sometimes they're very high profile things, and most prominently now on abortion rights. But all kinds of things you'll see sometimes very big policy changes put to a direct vote. And there's two basic ways that can happen. One is state legislators or local legislators can put something on the ballot. Sometimes they want to, other times they have to if they're amending the state constitution. Sometimes it has to go to a direct vote. And then there's another mechanism, a citizen initiative, where people can gather signatures on a petition, and there's a mechanism for a certain amount of signatures, and you can submit them in a certain timeline. And if you do that, in theory, it goes to a direct vote. You put it on the ballot, people can vote on it, and if they vote it up, it's policy, it's law. And so Pennsylvania doesn't have a citizen initiative system, but Pittsburgh, the city of Pittsburgh, does. Most municipalities do have some kind of a system like this. It hasn't been used very often here and a lot of places. But so I really had no idea how it worked. And by the way, it turns out not a lot of other people did either, including people in city government and elections lawyers and things like that. But I did know based on the research how to find out. And so I was like, okay, this is a great idea. Let me go try to explore and see actually if this is even possible. And like I said, it was more difficult than I would have imagined to actually get some hard answers on this. In fact, well, I can come back to this, but like even up until the right before, like after we had already made the ballot, right before the final court decision that got us kicked off the ballot, there was still a question mark about like exactly the amount of signatures we would need because there's contradicting things in the state constitution and the home rule charter. Anyway, by the time I sort of managed to figure out like this is really possible, we can do this, the timeline was outrageously short. And anyone who works in these things knows like number one rule is you need to start well ahead of time to build all kinds of infrastructure and make sure you have everything in place you need and make sure you have enough funding to be able to do this and that. And we didn't have any of that. But myself and a few other people, like extremely grassroots, just like word of mouth, talking to other folks who are interested in this, who were organizers or well connected. And so like there was just this sense that like let's try it. Let's just try. Like we absolutely don't have the time. This was like brought up early and often by a lot of folks with experience. Like we do not have the time to do this correctly. But the moral urgency of the moment just seemed like, look, we don't get to choose the conditions that we struggle in, right? And it's like we have this idea, we have the people that we can like in theory stand this up and let's just try, And if we don't make it, then maybe we end up with a lot of signatures we can use as a pressure campaign. We can run it back next year. And one of the things that I find really compelling about the ballot initiative process itself is, it's like if you don't end up on the ballot, it's not over. You still end up with like a lot of conversations you had. Like we talked to tens of thousands of people across the city about Palestine, about solidarity, about what we can do as taxpayers here to actually influence the outcome. Right? We all been watching the horrific news coming out of Gaza and across Palestine, and I think one of the overwhelming feelings is just like we can't do anything. It's helplessness, right? And of course, there's things we can do. We can protest, we can disrupt. But this is sort of another avenue. And I think there was a sense among the organizers, like people really want to be able to do something. And if you're, again, one way or another, we come out with having all these conversations with people about this and spreading, the circles of people who are knowledgeable about it and who, who feel that we can come together and connect with people and do something about it. So we thought, yeah, let's what the hell, let's give it a shot. And I think it ended up going just phenomenally better than any of us really thought it might at the beginning, when we first started. There's a 7-week period in Pittsburgh where you can gather signatures for an initiative like this. And it's a very high threshold. It's that you need 10% of the previous gubernatorial vote in the city. So in our case, it was 12,434, I believe. So basically 12,500 signatures, way more than you need to run for mayor or senate or anything like that, by orders of magnitude. It's a very high threshold for this in 7 weeks. And by the time we really got our shit together, we had 5 weeks to go. And we just took a shot at it, and we managed to mobilize some of the folks who were involved in city government, or in local campaigns previously, and said that we more than tripled the previous record for amount of volunteers on any campaign in a matter of weeks. And we got 15,000 signatures. So we got more than the amount needed in those 5 weeks. By the last couple weeks when it was really going, I mean, it's you couldn't step outside in a bunch of Pittsburgh neighborhoods and not run into 3 people who were canvassing for this. I mean, it really just it was incredible, the amount of enthusiasm behind it. And so that's a bit of a background on what we did. We managed to qualify initially. The way the city does it is they look at the signatures we submit, and they sort of do a facial review. They just look it over and see how many of these look legit. You have to be a voting resident in the city of Pittsburgh. How many look legit? How many are in Pittsburgh? How many aren't duplicate names or names of celebrities or someone who's not serious. And sometimes they take a subset and they actually try to verify their voter registration. And based on that, they said, okay, this looks legit. It looks like you have more than enough legit signatures. So it will qualify for the ballot in November. So for 1 week, we were on the ballot in November. And I'll pause there, but I can get into what happened after that. Ultimately, we're not going to be on the ballot in this November.
Yeah, I mean, so just really quick, just to make it kind of clear for folks, could you just remind people like sort of generally what this text on the ballot was going to be, and then because I think one thing that's really notable is just like on our side, you had reached out to us in August to want to come on and talk about this, and then pretty quickly we got some difficult news. So just tell people what this was. On the tech side, and then what ended up happening to this question.
And actually, before we get into what happened, can you just like go into a little bit more about like that the moments of organizing, the types of conversations that this text sort of inspired in folks too? Yeah,
totally. Right, good point. I should back up and talk about the actual thing itself. So the text of it, the initial idea that some of us kicked around was to not even mention Israel directly, just for the sake of trying to, move some of the opposition out of the way, and do something like the city of Pittsburgh would have to divest from any country that is being accused of genocide by the ICJ, right? Like, how can you be against that? But some of the lawyers who consulted with us pro bono at the front end said that you can't base U.S. legislation on foreign court decisions. That wouldn't hold up in court here. And so, we bandied it about, and we decided, look, no, let's just say what it is. And so the actual text was that the city of Pittsburgh, that no public resources in the city could go to the state of Israel on 3 conditions. So unless and until there was a ceasefire in Gaza, humanitarian aid would be allowed to reach the people in need, and equal rights would be granted to everybody living in the territories that Israel controls. And so, something that I would try to tell a lot of the, news, and which was overwhelmingly on, the side of opposition. It's like, this is actually quite a moderate proposal, right? We're just like, these are things that we should not really have to argue too hard about, right? We know a ceasefire has majority support in both political parties and has for a long time. And, humanitarian aid being allowed to reach people is should be a no-brainer. And hopefully we can all agree that people should have equal rights, regardless of their race or ethnicity or religion. And so all those, we shouldn't be sending money to a country, and we shouldn't be doing business with a country that denies people rights based on their ethnicity and religion, and certainly not for their ethnic cleansing policies. And so, the idea was that it was actually a very moderate proposal in those ways. So yeah, that's a little bit on the text itself. I think, if we do decide to run it back, and there's a lot of interest in that, I think we would adjust the wording based on a few things. This was again, we learned a lot over the course of this process. But that was the basic idea there. And yeah, I mean, the organizing part of this was, there's all kinds of things that I would do differently, but with the amount of time we had, it really is just I'm still overwhelmed by the amount of support that came in with just an incredibly short amount of time with no organizational infrastructure. That's another thing, the opposition and news also couldn't get their heads around. It was there's no group behind it. This is just this is the definition of grassroots. This is a bunch of people. Yeah, we're all connected to different things, and we ended up having more than a dozen local organizations endorse. But this isn't a group doing it. This is just a bunch of people doing this, and just more and more volunteers pouring in because they care about it. DSA, the local DSA chapter was the fiscal sponsor. And so a lot of people assumed it was DSA. It was not, even though they endorsed it, and a lot of folks were DSA. We briefly had another fiscal sponsor, a statewide liberal organization called Keystone Progress, who revoked that at some point. That's a whole story into itself. But yeah, this is all things we were standing up as we went. We were doing this organizing as we went, and completely shoestring budget. We ended up raising about $17,000, which we used to pay some of our volunteer field folks for the last couple of weeks and to pay for a lawyer. Yeah, I mean, even a lot of the people who know things about, know local politics were saying on the beginning, if you do this, you're going to need $150,000 to make the ballot at all, just for that. And the most conservative estimates were maybe 50 grand you could do it. And so it's just an absolutely shoestring budget for this sort of a thing. We managed to get that many signatures, and it was really just the overwhelming support of volunteers. I mean, people just putting in all kinds of hours, really working around the clock. By the last couple of weeks, I mean, you couldn't go, like people were going to house parties. People were like at the clubs at 2 a.m. when you get out. People were just like, I was, for example, like that last weekend of signature gathering was just like going up and down lines outside of like diners and breakfast spots and just talking to whoever. Like you couldn't, it was like, yeah. And also people with all kinds of skills leaning in. I mean, like people who have all kinds of data skills doing, validation of voter stuff, people like figuring out the field organizing, people who are very experienced in all these different areas of organizing, leaning in and volunteering their skills. Really just amazing to see. And I think that kind of energy, by the way, is all over the place when it comes to Palestine solidarity. And one of the goals we had was letting other folks know you can do this too. This is a mechanism a lot of places have. We can put this to direct vote. Like we don't have to keep asking and getting a no. It's pretty clear at this point what the answer is from the leadership of both political parties. And so, it's also clear, by the way, in terms of like polling nationally, that majorities support a ceasefire. That majorities now, even majorities in the Democratic Party support an arms embargo. Mm-hmm. This has been clear for a long time. Okay, so we can put it to a vote and we can add to pressure from that angle. Anyways, yeah, so that's, I'm still like kind of like coming down from the whole thing, so I can kind of get off on some tangents. But
no, we appreciate it.
I mean, I think that's just like a really important point to make, not just regarding ballot initiatives, but just like in general. Like I'm speaking to you and Matt, and like to the audience out here, is that like what's going on right now in Gaza is just unbelievable pain and suffering. And one thing that I think would make it harder would be to sort of walk around our towns and where we live and sort of think, oh, everybody in this country like supports that. And the fact of the matter is that the American people do not. And I think, it's scary in a lot of ways to realize that our political system is so separated from public will like that it is the way that it is in this country. But, I think it's very, very, very important actually to be able to do this kind of work, if for anything, to build, community and movements and build those kind of connections. And also just to remind people that like we as a people in this country are horrified about what's going on in Gaza.
Yeah. Yeah, 100%. I mean, you can start feeling like if you're just scrolling all the time about it, you can start feeling like you're crazy. Because the way the like media treats it, the way the higher up elected officials treat it. But yeah, you go around, you actually walk around and talk to folks, and you get a sense of where people are really at. And like anything, if you're getting people to sign, there's some people who just like don't even let you start. They just don't, they think they're selling something or whatever it is. They don't want to hear about it. And there were some people who were hostile, but the vast majority of people were receptive. And there was a lot of people that I spoke to personally, and I heard this from a lot of volunteers, who like you barely get a sentence out. You start talking about like, do you want to see a ceasefire in Gaza? Do you believe in a free Palestine? They're just like, let me stop you right there. I'll sign it. Like people were just like ready to do something about it. Really overwhelming. And also just, there was a lot of people who didn't know a whole lot who were like interested in listening. Like, yeah, I've been hearing about this. What's going on? You can have that conversation about it. With people who are frankly, I mean, I think people are pretty fed up with a lot of our politicians for all kinds of reasons. And, when you start talking about canvassing for something, they think it's political. A lot of people's first thought is like, it's a politician, like, I don't want to hear anymore. But I had those conversations too, where it's like, no, it's not about any of them. It's about putting something to a direct vote. It's about this thing. All of a sudden, people are ready to listen because, this is actually something we can do together as residents and taxpayers in the city. But yeah, I mean, that solidarity was really palpable. And, we also got polling done, by the way, which I want to rep more, because that was a really big win that I was hoping would get a little bit more, would like be able to have a little bit more impact in the moment. But still, I think it's important to put out there, because there's been a lot of national polls about this, like I just mentioned. But we got a poll done locally by one of the really big professional polling agencies on condition that their names stay off of it. They were really curious about this too, though. And it was directly about this. It wasn't like, in theory, do you support this? It was like the exact language of this ballot. Would you vote for this, yes or no? And it was Pennsylvania voters, demographically weighted to Pittsburgh, but it was across Pennsylvania. Way more people and way more robust than a lot of the polls that you see nationally. And the folks who did it were like, when we first spoke to them, we're like, there's no way this comes out positive. You know that, right? Like, well, we're curious, but like, there's no way this has a majority support. We were like, let's just see. Let's see, and they came back just blown away. Like, this is incredible. I mean, it was, so the way ballot initiative polling often works, when it comes to questions that aren't like clearly partisan, you often get pretty high, like unsure rates. So in our case, it was like right in the norms, about 30% of people who reported like, I don't know. So the way you usually do is take those out and you look at the head-to-head yes versus no. And the sort of industry standard is you want to be more than plus 10 in the head-to-head, like early in the campaign. And if you are, it's a very good chance you win at the ballot. And so in our case, it was 63% of people said they would vote for it across demographics. But the most amazing thing was that every single crosstab was positive except for one, which was Republican voters. Even that wasn't unanimous, though. Even that was like 35% in support. But other than that, every single crosstab, racial demographics, gender, age, even like the older voters, voters who were like 65 plus, that was about 50-50, but it broke slightly toward yes. But younger voters was like 75%, and like really overwhelming support. Democratic voters, more than 70%. It was like across the board, people wanted to vote for this. And that was, obviously that was like validating for us, but it was also like, it's something that other folks should take into account. This is like, people really want action on this. And so, it was the combination of being able to talk to folks and also having like the reason to conduct a poll like this, where it's not theoretical. It's like, actually, we are gathering signatures for this. Would you vote yes or no? And so, yeah, that result, I think, should really be heartening to the folks who want to keep organized. There's not a lot of reason for optimism, especially with the horrors that we see. But this sort of thing, I think, should motivate the folks who want to organize, on this basis for Palestine solidarity, to know that, the majority is with this.
And I'll just note, you say the two parties, the lack of mobility. Pennsylvania, I don't handicap elections, relatively important in this coming one. But yeah.
Man,
Sorry, I accidentally muted myself there. But without getting too bogged down in that, so the people are ready for this, Ben. The legal system, not so much. Is that what I gather?
Sort of. I wouldn't, just for one moment to get more bogged down in it. Like, I do think it's important that it's Pennsylvania, because it's not Michigan, right? Even some of the like national news, like, well, Michigan, the Democrats should care because there's a lot of Arab American or Palestinian American, Muslim American voters. And that's true. But also, cities that don't have a very high proportion of those demographics also care, and states that do. So I do think that's extra important. But so the process was, we always knew we would face legal challenges, and one thing that was a lot of learning. There's a very steep learning curve on this, but one thing was we did keep it relatively quiet during the campaign, during the petition drive, in hopes of reducing some of the opposition that might be there. I don't know if it did, but if it did, then I would be frightened to see what the opposition would have looked like if we had been more public about it, but because it was pretty wild. And that's another thing, by the way, that initiatives like this do that I think is productive, is that they clarify who's on what side. And basically all the leadership, the higher up leadership in city government came out against it. The city controller's office filed a lawsuit to kick us off the ballot, which frankly strikes me as a conflict of interest, because it would be her job to actually do this, to make this happen. It'd create a lot of work for her, frankly. That's true. But it's not really your job to try to tell people what they should and shouldn't be able to vote on when it comes to the city budget. Rachel Heisler, the city controller, sponsored one lawsuit to kick us off the ballot based on the ballot wording, saying that it wasn't legally enforceable, all sorts of just absolute hysterics about the city would grind to a halt if we divested from Israel. Because what if we use, Microsoft computers? The city employees wouldn't be able to type the next day. I mean, really, this is the sort of thing they were saying to media. What if the ambulances are Ford? They wouldn't be able to drive the next day. It's no one is saying that. Obviously, no one is saying that. Those contracts might have to not get renewed. They might have to that's something we want the city to take into account when they contract with companies. That's true. but there's nothing in there that says like the existing ambulances can't drive the next day. Just like obviously trying to fearmonger about this. Also when people say things like that, it's like, the contradictions at the heart of the people who support the Israeli war machine just like come out when it comes to this. Because like when there was earlier in the year, there was an attempt to get the county council to pass a ceasefire resolution. And so many people lined up to testify. They had to split the hearing over 2 days. It was one of those things. And ultimately, most of them, of course, voted against it, although 3 people voted for it, some of whom have been very supportive. But one of the lines of reasoning why we shouldn't is like we shouldn't get involved in this. Like this is a thing that goes on over there. And it's like when you want the county council to vote on a ceasefire, this isn't our business. But all of a sudden, when you want to divest from this country, like apparently our local like economy is entirely dependent on like doing business with Israeli companies and companies that do business with Israel. Anyway, so yeah, that was one challenge. And then the other one came from the Jewish Federation of Greater Pittsburgh, who shamefully, this was really a mask off moment. They brought in literally the lawyers that Trump initially used to overturn the election in Pennsylvania. The same individuals, like some of the most sought after GOP lawyers in the state, like specialize in this, in exactly this, right? And like who, like they brought in to disenfranchise voters in 2020. They hired
the anti-democracy guys. Yeah.
That's exactly those folks. And yeah, I have a lot to say about all that. So they brought in those folks on a number of challenges, but the main one was the signatures, which is like, we see this around the country. So whenever folks want to kick an initiative off the ballot, one of the ways to do it is to come for the signatures. And, you can sort of force a litigation of line by line. Is someone, a legit signatory or not? And, some of that, okay, like you do have to get a certain amount of signatures. That's for real. But then there's also, so like there's ones that we can agree if someone's not registered to vote, like they can't legally sign, or they can sign it, but it doesn't count. But then there's all this other stuff where it's like, okay, well, if they misspelled their street name, or if they didn't put their apartment number, or if there's like an error, if they like, whatever it is, if they put the date instead of the zip code, like things like that. And the form, by the way, is not intuitive. Like, there's like the address and then the date instead of the zip code, and people often just write the zip because they're used to it. Whatever, if people cross something out and correct it, there's all kinds of things you can nitpick. And, based on the way that the county elections department came down on like what they were and weren't going to let us defend in court, it became clear very quickly, like over the course of like a couple days, like the weekend before our court date, that we just weren't going to have enough signatures. And it also then really at the 11th hour became clear that if we did go to court to try to fight this, knowing that we didn't have the signatures, we would open ourselves up to all kinds of lawsuits and things like that, which I think is what the opposition was hoping for. They were really, by the way, in the court date itself, they were really hoping they could sue DSA for this. They were like trying to take down DSA. And it came as a surprise, like a surprise and a disappointment to them that like, this is not a DSA thing. Like they still didn't understand that DSA fiscally sponsored it, but it was not a DSA campaign. They were confused by that even in the court date itself and like clearly upset. Like they were hoping to come after the DSA.
And I'm sorry, I just not to make too much of a political point here, but let's be very clear about what these forces are trying to do. Not just are they taking a side on like the Gaza conflict, but they're also saying we don't want to ask the people this question, right? And I just think that like be very, it's important to be very clear about what these kind of forces are representing, not just a certain relationship that the United States should have to an apartheid government in Israel, but also one that's saying, hey, I don't want Pittsburghers to be consulted about whether or not their tax dollars or their city is engaged in financially supporting this kind of institution.
Yeah, absolutely. And, the sort of tactics, it went to really, really nasty stuff. Like there were local, like news agencies that participated in doxing people who signed the petition. That, resulted in, at least in one instance, a very higher up in the city, the communication director for the mayor resigning because she signed the petition and the mayor accepting that resignation for, someone who signed a civic petition saying the voters, this is the other thing. I mean, like what you point out is right, David, that like signing this petition technically also didn't mean you're voting for it. It means you think the voters should get to decide. I think the vast majority of people who signed it did want to vote for it. But I personally had a couple people I spoke to who were against it, who like were in, one guy, for example, I talked to outside the public library, and he was like offended and upset. He said, no, I support Israel. And he came back, to his credit, he came back about an hour later and he was like, I've been thinking about it and I disagree with this. I'll vote against it, but I do believe people have a right to vote on this. And so I'll sign. So there were people like that who, credit to the folks who actually believe in democracy. But so like to actually come at and vilify people who signed this petition based on, based on just like, all kinds of horrible accusations, the stuff you'd expect. Anti-Semitism, is the main one. Which, don't get me started. But like really for people who are just saying, we want to have a say in this. We want the voters to have a say.
I mean, that's fascinating. I mean, so yeah, and you can talk about like the disappointment. That's crazy about the DSA, that they had the knives out for DSA like that. That's is that the DSA? I mean, I guess it's something to keep track of. If I'm sure they're not gonna. That's not the last time they're gonna try to do that. But I guess going forward, you think take another bite at the apple next go round, or what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, the disappointment was real. I mean, it was well, I should also say on the DSA front, yeah, that is something to be aware of. And I think if we did try again, we would stand up different type of legal infrastructure to, like its own 501c4. It takes time to set that up. It's quick to set up a PAC, but with a PAC, donors' names are on there. The C4, it's not necessarily. And for something like this, it might really help to have the C4. I mean, it was not like, I'm not a member of DSA. I'm really, and I don't say that because I'm against a lot of what DSA does. I just don't happen to be a member of it. But, and a lot of DSA folks were involved, but not everybody. And it wasn't a DSA thing. But it was really great that they fiscally sponsored it. Anyway, yeah, but the knives out for them was notable. The disappointment, it was rough. I mean, that was a rough weekend. And this is also like, this was a volunteer effort. Like those of us who were doing this were sleep deprived, we're strung out. We have all our other like life stuff, we all have our other lives going on. And people were just like working around the clock on this for a long time. And the real roller coaster of it all, trying to figure out things as it just came to light, especially that last week when the legal challenges came in and being in court and trying to figure out what signatures were what. And so when that info came to light, the decision got made very quickly with sort of a handful of people who were on the steering committee who were around and sort of like, responsive, not ideal. And there was definitely some repair work to be done because there was so many volunteers. I mean, 500 plus people who, volunteered for this. Not everybody got the memo, and we initially were like, let's like pack the court. Let's turn people out for this to defend it. And then that decision ended up getting made so quickly and the communication was not great with everybody. Some people felt like, understandably, confused and upset by that. And so it was definitely some work to be done to be like, okay, here's what happened. Here's how it all went down. Having a more a clear formal lines of, of sort of structure for the campaign next time will be really important. But yeah, it was a tough one. It was really tough, especially seeing how the media treated it, which is not a surprise, but I mean, some of it, it's like some folks would interview. There was a handful of us who were like willing to have our names on it and be public. I was one of those people. And some would interview us and then not use it or use one clip and be slanted. That's to be expected. But there was a lot of these local news, broadcasters or papers who wouldn't even say what the thing was. They would describe it literally as like, petition that the Jewish Federation describes as anti-Semitic. That's it. Like without any details or links to what it is, like really journalistic malpractice. I mean, to say nothing of the doxing stuff. I mean, so, and they had their little, like their Trump lawyer victory lap for a moment. I do think the weight and the gravity of what we accomplished in such a short time, I think was absolutely noticed. I mean, it caused a shitstorm in local city government. And, again, brought together a lot of different folks, a lot of different organizations, coalition that don't normally work together. So there's a lot, I think, to build off of there. And I think the idea is to sort of take a moment, let it all just sort of like settle for a bit. Have the different coalition groups can have those conversations in their organizations. We can explore other, the sort of fiscal legal infrastructure, what it'll take for next time, and then come back together and talk about if we want to run it back next year. But I do think that there's a lot of appetite to do it here. And I also hope that other folks elsewhere take it up, because this is the sort of thing, like, the U.S. is one of the only countries in the world that calls itself a democracy that doesn't have a national initiative and referendum system. Only about half the states do. But like I said, most municipalities do. And so wherever you are, this is a mechanism you can use for this and for other things. I hope increasingly people take this to the direct vote. And because it's one thing we know. I mean, this is obviously preaching to the choir with you and a lot of, your listeners here. But, this is we really can have an impact this way. The United States funds this. This cannot happen. The Israeli government's genocidal policies cannot go on without U.S. weapons and funding. And that means we have leverage as people living in this country, as taxpayers. If we change that arrangement, we will change the status quo on the ground. And so I think, it's incumbent on us to use all the avenues available to us that we think are going to be productive. And this is one we haven't explored. I don't think as far as I know, no one's ever tried this before, putting this kind of divestment to a direct vote. In my research on initiatives, the only one I could find was a half-hearted attempt to divest from Iran in Colorado, 2018, I think, which, just sort of eyeballing the data, it looks to me like one of those things that an interest group sponsors in order to pressure politicians. It didn't make the ballot, it didn't come close. But certainly for Israel, I think it hasn't been tried before. But we know about the campaign to divest from apartheid South Africa in the 80s, and how much of an impact that had. We know how that starts to snowball. And once it gets rolling, everyone all of a sudden starts agreeing that this is the right thing and has always been the right thing. And, what better mechanism to use than a direct democratic vote where we can show this is what the people want.
I 100% agree. I think despite the, you didn't surmount what is a pretty hard to surmount obstacle here, I think it is promising. And yeah, it'd be great to see more, efforts along these lines, in addition to, maybe running socialist electeds. But this sort of referendum, where that infrastructure can be used, I think it's great that to attempt it.
And thank you so much for joining us. Going forward, is there anything, that we can sort of direct folks to keep up with ballot initiatives in general, or people in Pittsburgh who might be interested in sort of, keeping, some of these connections, alight?
Yeah, totally. I mean, I certainly hope if you have listeners in Pittsburgh who are interested, reach out to me. We still have a website that hasn't been updated, but the referendum was called No War Crimes on Our Dime. And so we have No War Crimes on our info at nowarcrimesonourdime.com is an email that's still, you can still email that. Get in touch with me personally though, if you want. My info's out there because I'm an academic, and my email is out there. So feel free to reach out. We didn't have a social media or anything for various reasons, but we might in the future. But definitely keep an eye out. There's other stuff going on in the meantime. There's local pressure campaigns. For example, against this company Howmet that's based here. They make parts for the F-35, I think. So there's other divestment pressure campaigns going on that should support. And then hopefully we can run it back. As far as ballot initiatives go, my day job is writing about that. I sometimes cover the ballot initiative beat at Jacobin. The most recent one there was on the attempt to put Stop Cop City to a direct vote in Atlanta, and what the repression of that tells us about the state of our so-called democracy. I'll be putting more stuff out from time to time. I'm working on a book for Verso about ballot initiative strategy for the left. The editor there was luckily not too annoyed that I've been like spent my summer instead of writing the book actually like doing this campaign. But you know, like I said, sometimes action has to come before theory.
Praxis.
Yeah, exactly. So that hopefully that'll be in the works before too long. You mentioned the ink stick article. That's sort of separate, but I think also important. I think you know, obviously the spirit of that argument is still there, even though the numbers have changed. And you know, I think there's a lot that could be added to it. But that's still there. And then I guess I'll also mention, for what it's worth, there's another, if people are interested in like my writing on this otherwise, I have an article that I wrote a few years ago called Decolonizing Jewishness, which was in Tikkun magazine, which unfortunately closed its doors now. You can still find it online, I think, or if not, reach out. But sort of looking at Zionism and anti-Zionism and colonization and decolonization and these sorts of things from, I think, a different angle, and trying to win over. It's mainly for a Jewish audience, but I think it would be productive for a lot of folks, trying to like help folks understand that the historic struggle against anti-Semitism as a system of oppression that divides people based on like racial hierarchies, that's used to break the left. The historic struggle against anti-Semitism now, because of political Zionism and because the state of Israel has become fundamentally intertwined with Palestinian liberation. So you can't struggle for liberation from anti-Semitic system without also struggling for Palestine liberation. So the point I was making then was a few years ago, so it probably is a bit out of date, but still would be curious, folks, you know, thoughts if you want to check that out. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Ben, for all that work, and yeah, we'll have you on again when that Verso book comes out. Maybe.